Representative Pellicciotti, I'm going to shift over to you for a block of questions now. And I want to start with your background as a legislator and also as a prosecutor. I mentioned that you worked to pass campaign finance reform laws. You have fought against dark money and corporate influence. You also passed something called the Corporate Crime Act. How would all of that inform your work as treasurer?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. As I was mentioning earlier, one of the things that drove me to run for office in the first place and drives me today is getting corporate campaign donations out of politics and making it so that the voice of the people and associations of people are heard more in politics. So a lot of the fact that I've been free of those corporate donations have allowed for me to lead on a lot of the bills you talked about. Corporate Crime Act, which really came out of the fact that I've been prosecuting financial crimes and knew that the penalties against corporations that commit crimes in our state had not been increased in nearly a century, since 1924. I always would point that out to people that if a corporation committed the exact same criminal offense that any one of us did or any of your loved ones did, your loved ones would be looking at up to life in prison without the possibility of parole for committing a Class A felony. But if a corporation committed that exact same Class A felony, the same victimization, prior to my Corporate Crime Act that Representative Tarleton was a big supporter of as well, the penalty was $10,000. That was the maximum penalty. It was $10,000 a judge could impose against that entity. And it was past time to modernize the corporate structure, the way the laws were written to hold corporations accountable, and ultimately, obviously, the penalty as well. But a lot of the campaign finance work that you mentioned, my bill that I introduced in the House and passed into law to get dark money out of politics, my PAC transparency bill, so that for the first time you can't just have friendly sounding names on a mailer that you get in the mail and not know who the actual donors to that ad are. Now under my PAC transparency bill, it will actually indicate the top donors related to that bill. And a bill that I introduced with Senator Solomon and passed into law just this last session to ban foreign corporate donations to our political campaigns here in the state of Washington. And there's been so little enforcement on the federal side that it was past time to pass our own law here in Washington and step forward and do what we needed to do related to that. And all of this matters because the way a lot of these issues are set up, the way money moves matters a lot. And in other states, you have state treasurers leading on a lot of these campaign finance issues as well. So let me give you an example. In Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania state treasurer has a transparency portal that he has used to make it so that anytime a state contract is given out, it is put on the website that state contract was given out to an entity. Let's say it's a corporate entity, and it will list every politician that corporation donated to on the website related to that state contract. And the idea, of course, being that it will greatly it'll make an elected official question whether they want to accept certain money, if they're going to be involved in issuing something related to a state contract. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to advance things that have not been traditionally done, and certainly aren't being done by our Trump-supporting Republican incumbent, that will really make a big difference.
Just related to that, I would also like to ask about investment of public funds, because I think that's another area where having a strong progressive in position of treasurer could really make a difference, because it's seen as signaling a state's values. What are our public funds invested in right now, and what would you specifically change in the office?
Sure. Well, I was pointing out with our incumbent treasurer, he has been in the past for treasurer funded by the gun lobby. He's been funded by big tobacco. He's been funded by big banks. Even when all the information was coming out about the dangers of vaping, he accepted money from the vaping industry. And what we need is, when we do investments, that you should know that your treasurer has clean hands in being a part of that investment process. Now, a lot of our investments are done through a state investment board, for example. And so, especially if I were to serve as chair of the state investment board, it's particularly important, I think, that the treasurer have clean hands. So right now, for example, under the treasurer's watch, he on the state investment board has supported through support of index funds investment in a range of industries that I think would really shock people, right? Investment into things like firearm manufacturers, over $4 million in firearm manufacturers. And I think but the bigger question is less about just figuring out what specific things to invest in. What's more important to me is when you have a treasurer, the treasurer is not going to stand up to an energy company, for example, if they take money from energy companies. And part of stepping up to a company is truly holding that company accountable for the long-term interests of that company. And let me give you another example of that. Is when I was talking about energy companies, it is in the long-term interest of a lot of these companies to invest in a much quicker rate into renewables. It might not be in the short-term financial return, but in the long-term viability of that company, it is absolutely, if they are going to survive as we change our policies over the next 10, 20, 30 to 50 years, that they move into renewables at a much quicker rate. And one of the challenges that exists right now, it's one of the challenges in business, is just focus on the short-term return that boards have to increase stock prices a small amount, or for leaders of companies to then, after a year or two, move on to another company and show that they increase their stock price a marginal amount, even though in the long term, it's not in the long-term interest of that company. Well, because we own stock in a lot of these corporations, we can do what's called shareholder engagement. And what that means is we can team up with other like-minded states like Oregon, California, New Jersey, Maryland, New York, and collectively, we actually own a significant share with these public dollars in many companies around the country. And we can go in to boardrooms that most certainly have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, but they can ignore the protesters outside all they want. They can ignore, frankly, unless a law is passed, they can ignore policymakers. People like
but you have a controlling interest, is what you're saying.
Right. So but when the individual states can come forward collectively, we have a long-term interest in the viability of that company, and that the company exists for a long time. And let me give you another example. We can go collectively, and this is something I'm going to do as treasurer, and say we expect that the boards of the S&P 1500 companies better reflect the pension holders that we represent. And that means going to companies that right now, nationwide, have less than 30% of the board members are women. About a little over 3% are women of color. And we can go, because we know diversity is good for business, and certainly for the long-term interest of that company, to have a diverse perspective on its board. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to say we are not going to support any slates of any slates of board members that do not have at least 30% women. I will not vote for them if I'm chair of the state investment board. And I'm going to team up with other like-minded states to promote those same interests. And we are going to bring about very systemic change in a very major way that is good for our investments. It's good for our business, but the long-term business. And that's something that our Trump-supporting Republican incumbent, just as you might imagine, is not a part of right now.